This right here is my DS718 Plus. It is the very first NAS I ever bought, and unfortunately it only lasted me about a year before I had to upgrade. In this video, we're going to be talking about when you should upgrade your NAS, how to know, and basically what to look for when you are, because if you do, you can keep yourself from having these problems where you immediately upgrade again. So it's all about making sure that when you are upgrading, you know what you're upgrading to and you actually need it. Because had I picked out the right unit, I very easily would still be able to be using it today, 8 years later. So if you didn't know, I do professional consulting as my full-time job on Synology NASs and other NAS operating systems, just small business IT. There's a link for that down in the description below. But I come across a ton of people who are running NASs that have been running them for over 10 years. And honestly, Synologies last a really long time. They offer a very long security update window, and depending on who you are and what you're using them for, a unit that's 10 years old may still keep chugging along for you and you'd never notice the difference, even if you're a multi-person office. But on the flip side, it's also very common to need to upgrade for multiple reasons. And today, we're going to be talking about when you know you should need to upgrade and what to look for to make sure that that upgrade lasts you a really long time and you're not just jumping from NAS to NAS to NAS, spending a bunch of money on shells and hard drives unnecessarily. And so by far the most common reason why you need to upgrade is because you run out of space. And that was absolutely what happened to me 8 years ago with this DS718 Plus. I had no idea what a NAS was at the time. I was a photographer looking to figure out how to store my files, and I bought two 4TB Iron Wolf hard drives and set them up in this thing in a RAID 1 configuration. And to me, I thought it was going to last me forever. 4TB was a massive amount of space to me at that time, and I thought there was no way I was going to fill it up. It took me under a year to realize how wrong I was with that, and so I upgraded to the DS1819 Plus at the time, and that unit is still running my primary network today, running all my backups, because when I did upgrade to that, I learned a lot of things from this. But the number one reason why people need to upgrade is because they run out of space. But there's also some other options that I'm going to talk about here. So if you've just run out of space, you have a few different options other than buying a brand new NAS, and we're going to talk about kind of the benefits to all of them. One, you can obviously delete files, but let's be honest here, we don't want to go down that path probably, and you probably already knew that as well. So then the next option is to switch out your drives with larger drives. And it does depend on what size drives you've got, as well as how many bays you've got, if that's going to be cost effective or not. So as I said, I bought this thing with two 4TB Iron Wolf drives. Now, today, this right here is a 24TB hard drive. So if I wanted to, and I just needed like 12TB of space, I could have bought two of these, then replaced the 4TB drive the first time, had the RAID rebuild, and replaced the second one, and upgraded this unit to 24TB usable space. Now, with a 2-bay NAS like this, it's generally not cost effective to do that due to the fact that with a RAID 1, you're losing half of your space. What would make a lot more sense to do is if I had this unit right here, I would very much favor having the 24TB upgrades because say I had filled this with 5 4TB drives. 5 4TB drives would have given me 16TB of usable space in a RAID 5 configuration, but with the 24TB drives, that jumps up to 96TB of usable space. So before you upgrade, do a little bit of a cost-benefit analysis to look at, can I just upgrade to larger drives and save a lot of money? Because if you're just looking to get more drive bays and you're running smaller drives, anything under about 8TB, it's very common to be way more cost-effective to do that, especially if you're running what's called SHR1. With SHR1, you can actually go ahead and upgrade just 2 of the drives to get more space every incremental time. I talk about that in another video. I'll go ahead and leave a link to that down in the description below. But with SHR, you do get that more flexibility. With RAID, you have to upgrade all the drives before you see any more space in the volume. So right off the bat, that is one way to not have to upgrade your NAS. If you can just upgrade your drives, it a lot of times can be much more cost effective, especially if the unit is relatively new. There are other ways to get more space out of a NAS. You can also use an expansion unit. So both of these units take a 5-bay expansion unit, though that can be kind of expensive. But now with these 24 terabyte drives, as I said, you can put 100 terabytes of usable space in an expansion unit, which can make it much more cost effective. So just because you've run out of space does not guarantee that you need to buy a bigger NAS, but especially if you're somebody who's got like a 2-bay, a lot of times it will be more cost effective to instead upgrade to something like this DS1522 Plus, which is a 5-bay, just because that RAID gives you a lot more usable space when you've got 5 drives than when you've got 2. Because of the fact that with RAID 1, you lose half your drives, whereas with RAID 5, you only lose 1 of the 5 drives. So that can not only save you a lot of money, but also get you more performance. So the next reason why you do need to upgrade, and this one's not as easy to get around, is performance. If your NAS is running slow and you need to run like Synology Drive and things like that, that takes up some CPU, there's not a lot of ways around that. I'm going to loop both CPU and RAM spec into the same barrel, though technically some of these NASs do have the ability to expand RAM. That doesn't help as much as other things are unless you're actually running out of RAM. But in a lot of cases, especially if you got like a J model, you can very quickly be using regular Office file server things, especially if you're including Synology Drive, and just not have enough performance out of the CPU. And that is one of those cases where you do need to upgrade. So obviously, if it's working for you, it's working for you. And don't worry about upgrading just because something new shiny comes out. But if you're finding that doing regular operations are just slow, then it makes sense to upgrade. And when you're upgrading, don't just upgrade the one thing that you need. So say you were running a 10-year-old 2-bay NAS and you were already running low on space, but really it's running slow, so you want to upgrade it. Don't just buy a new 2-bay unit because you're already going to be running out of space on that as well. When you're doing these upgrades, try to take into account all the things. It's not that much more expensive to go for a 5-bay than it is for a 2-bay in a lot of cases, especially when you say that this unit may last you 3 times as long. So when you are upgrading, it's really important to take all this into account. But there are a few reasons why you need to upgrade due to performance. One, it's just CPU bound. And the easy way to tell that is do your regular work, log into DSM, and just see what the CPU says it's at. If it's often over 90% or 80%, and you're finding that the NAS is slow trying to do operations that should be able to do, then it's probably just an old model that the CPU is not running very fast on. So excluding home labbers who are like actually running some crazy services and virtual machines and video transcoding, that is most common to happen in J models. Those home labbers can saturate just about anything that a Synology will sell you for a reasonable price. But for regular home users and office users, if you do have a J model, it's very likely that it just does not perform well enough to meet your needs. The J models are cost effective, but they also just do not have that much performance on the hood. And while they might start out as fine, as the years go on, they're much more likely to show their age far faster than their Plus units. So you really can start to notice them slowing down way faster than the Plus units. And so the final part about performance that you do need to upgrade, especially if it's older, is networking speed. So if you're somebody who's wanting to go from a 1 gigabit connection to a 10 gigabit connection, then these older NASs, unless they're the larger bay units, did not come with the ability to expand out to faster networking speeds. Synology has started adding in these slots for add-in cards right here. So you can actually go ahead and plug in a 10 gigabit card later on down the line, even in their 2-bay units in some cases. But in a lot of ways, that is one of those things where you do have to upgrade. Now, if you are a home labber and a tinkerer, you can look at buying and installing a USB adapter for like 2.5 gig on a NAS, and there's a ton of videos out there on how to do that. I don't tend to recommend it unless you are that tinkerer who the NAS is really more of a like learning opportunity than actually running a business off of. But that is another reason why you do need to upgrade, is you just don't have the ability to expand your networking. So all those things I mentioned are not really time dependent. all of the things I mentioned so far have been basically your use case for the NAS has changed. And so that's why it's very common to see offices who have been running the same NAS for 10 years, because if you're just using Office documents and storing it as a basic Windows file share, that can last for years and none of the performance things I just talked about here you would ever run into. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the only time-based one, and that is security updates. So I think Synology does a very good job of keeping up with security updates, even for older units. But about a month ago, Synology removed support for DSM 6.2. So that means that if there's a critical vulnerability found, you're not going to be able to update to it. They're not going to be fixing those older operating systems. And if I'm being honest with you, that's a pretty good timeline. Pretty much every NAS that could not upgrade to DSM-7 is well over 10 years old at this point. So in most cases, you will get security updates for at least 10 years from Synology. They're very good about that and they've got good longevity. But if you are one of those people who is still running a NAS that is 10 years old and it's only able to run DSM 6.2, at this point, it probably makes sense to upgrade. That's because you don't want to be running something that doesn't get any security updates. If you're on a closed network and you disable all remote access to it, it can work, but in a lot of cases, the cost of these systems is cheap enough where most offices I would highly recommend upgrading once your unit reaches end of life. That's because you just don't want to risk these critical documents getting corrupted or any other problems or getting a virus because simply your unit can't be patched against a known vulnerability. And the other thing is, especially if you've had the same hard drives with the unit the entire time and only had to replace one or two of them, those hard drives likely are showing their age if they've not already, and are likely going to start failing at a higher and higher rate every single year. So in general, when you're getting a NAS that's reached end of life, it probably does make sense to upgrade it if you have the ability to. Obviously, if you don't, set up a firewall, make sure it doesn't talk to anything other than the local network, but it still makes a lot of sense to upgrade if you can. All right, so I've just talked about the people who should look into upgrading. Everything I went over there is really people who should look into upgrading. Now let's talk about how to time it and figure out what to upgrade to. Because as you may notice, Synology does not create new NASs that often. In general, there's maybe a 2 or 3 year cycle in between NAS updates, and sometimes it's even longer. Right now, we're waiting on the DS 1825 Plus is my flagship desktop unit to them, and the previous version is the DS 1821 Plus. So the other component about buying a new NAS is knowing when to buy. It's a really hard thing to time, but I'm going to talk about the current market, what I would look for, and when I would say, yeah, there's probably an upgrade coming on that's going to be worth it and you're going to regret not having it, versus, is it a small upgrade? Probably not going to be a huge deal. And I'm going to start with really my favorite NASs out here. The DS 1522 Plus. This is one of my most recommended NASs behind the DS 1821 Plus. And I would say, even though it is a 22 model, the counterpart to it that's the exact same unit with just a slightly different RAM amount and a single less bay is the 923 Plus. So I believe that those two units will be supported together for a long time. And the other thing is there is a massive performance update between this and its predecessor. So the DS 1520 Plus was pretty lackluster in terms of CPU capability, and this unit absolutely gave it so much more performance in comparison between the two of them. And because of that, this one is going to run for longer, much better than its predecessor is. So I would still absolutely recommend this. The other thing is it does have the ability to upgrade to 10 gigabit on the back of it and have 2 expansion bays. And it's got the CPU throughput to saturate a 10 gigabit connection. With all that, I'd say it's absolutely still a great model. And I don't think, even if tomorrow a DS 1525 comes out, I don't think it's going to happen. But even if that does come out, I don't think you'll be feeling like you really left a lot on the table with that unit. And that goes the same for a lot of the smaller units today. I don't think that when they get updated, there's going to be this massive performance update that we saw, because there was a huge update already, and these things have CPUs that are powerful enough to run the network very quickly. And I don't think there's really a huge gap there where it's worth it to put a much more powerful CPU in there. So in general, on the smaller units, I don't think it's necessarily something you really need to wait out and see. Now, obviously, if you don't care and you're really looking in like a 2-year horizon for when you want to upgrade, it does make sense to time it when new units come out. Synologies don't really get cheaper. They pretty much launch and end with the exact same price until new models come out, and then you can sometimes get a deal with them. But in general, their price at launch tends to be consistent throughout the entire product life cycle until it is replaced. The other unit I do want to talk about is the DS1821 Plus, and this is one that is hard to say. So that unit, we know there is an update coming on the horizon. The DS1825 Plus is going to be out not too long, if I had to guess. But not too long could be 3 days, 3 months, 6 months. It's hard to say when it's actually going to come out. And the other thing is, it's hard to say what it'll actually contain and how valuable it'll be as an update. I will say, while I think those units will be supported for a very long time, even if there's not a massive update, so even if there's not a huge boost in CPU or overall capability, if you are looking for something that's going to last you 10 years, if you're starting with like an 1821 Plus, that's already 3 or 4 years old today. So now you've only got 7 years. Versus waiting for a 1825 Plus, you will get the full 10 years out of that, assuming they've got a 10-year life cycle. So that is one thing to think about with that. And really with the 1821 Plus, if it were me and it was really a, hey, I'm looking to buy in the next 3 to 6 months, I would probably wait for the DS1825 Plus to come out. I'm betting that there's not going to be a massive performance update to it because I don't think there needs to be. Those units that I deploy will be able to pull 2 gigabytes of data per second off of a 25 gigabit card. And for the stated purpose of a NAS, that's absolutely everything it needs to be. So don't see that there's a massive performance need in them at all. But what I do think will happen is, 1, you'll get that longer life cycle. 2, I think they will also have built-in networking options so you don't have to spend as much money today for faster speeds. And 3, you'll also just get a more powerfully built unit that maybe will matter more in 5 years when you are running these faster and faster workflows as they become more and more common. But it's really unit by unit. If you notice, when I do my reviews, I focus on capability of the NAS rather than actually looking at CPU. CPU benchmarks can tell you a lot, but they can also hide a lot of things. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what CPU is actually in the NAS. What matters is how the NAS performs, which is the most important thing. And so if you ever look at my reviews, I really try to focus on that the most. And I don't think many things on the lineup are really where they're lacking performance and going to have a large generational leap. But overall, when we're looking at the higher end NASs, the higher end desktop NASs, the 1522 Plus up to the 1821 Plus, they're definitely reaching the end of their sales life. We can see that there are updates on the horizon for those. But one thing I do want you to take into account when you're reading online comments is you will see a lot of people online saying that they are horrible CPUs and underpowered. And I'll be honest with you, they're not. They're underpowered and you never run it as a desktop operating system, but they're not designed to be. So when you are looking at those comments online, take that into account because NASs do not need to have the biggest, baddest CPUs in them. They really just don't need to. Okay, so I want to close out this video by talking about what things to look for when you are upgrading to make sure that your upgrade will last you a really long time. And the very first and most important thing is to look at overall storage usage. Think about how much storage you're using today and how that's grown over time. And that is going to be the number one thing. And really, if you can, try to leave at least 2 or 3 bays empty of your NAS if you're somebody who's going to use a lot of space for future expandability. And at the same time, don't just buy smaller drives. I tend not to recommend buying under 12 terabyte drives because you can get so much more space out of 24 terabyte drives and they are the same cost per terabyte. So especially if you're somebody who's going to be really growing their files and needing 50 terabytes plus, try to leave yourself some margin with extra bays because that will mean that as your space needs increase, you can slot in a few more drives and get more space out of it. So that is a number one thing to look for with that. And two, look for expandability. A lot of the larger units today have the ability to have 1 or 2 expansion units. And now we've got 24 terabyte drives, 5-bay expansion units can give you 100 terabytes per. So it can be really useful to have those and the ability to just online expand more space if you need it. The next thing is absolutely upgradable networking. Even if you're just running a 1 gigabit network today, if you are somebody who is doing more than just PDFs and Word documents, and you know in the future that's going to grow, look at least getting a NAS that has the ability to upgrade to faster networking speeds, or get a NAS with 2.5 gigabit to start. That should be a long lasting for most people if you're not doing heavy file pulling. And really look at what year the NAS came out. So the 1821, that 21 means it's a 21 model. So make sure you're not buying a NAS older than that. Unless you're getting a really good deal and you're just going for something cheap and you're getting it used, don't buy anything that has under a 21 in the name. So there are still sometimes some 1618s rolling around, and those are ones that just will not last you that long. And finally, don't upgrade until you need to. I know the new NASs come out and they're shiny and they're awesome, but you'd be surprised how long these things can last you, because even though newer NASs will have faster and faster CPUs, for a lot of workflows, it doesn't really matter. All right, well, that's going to be it for this. Go and leave any of the questions you've got down in the comments below, and have a good one. Bye.